with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, I have two friends. I have Dr. Kathy Allen, and she specializes in leadership, coaching, and organizational change in nonprofit organizations, foundations, small to mid-sized businesses, community development, higher educational institutions, and collaborative networks. Dr. Allen has written and presented widely on topics of leadership, human development, and organizational development. She is a skilled facilitator of organizational change and organizational development. The earmarks of her work are the creation of shared ownership of the results of a change project, long-term sustainable change for the organization, and increased capacity for the staff members and leaders in those organizations. Her most recent book is Leading from the Roots, Nature-Inspired Leadership Lessons for Today's World. This book firmly anchors leadership in the soil of nature. It's a foundational leadership framework for the challenges our 20th century views that leadership concepts can be universally applied to all contexts. And for listeners, listen to the second episode of Phronesis. Kathy Allen was the guest. We also have Rian Satterwhite. He serves as the director of the Office of Service Learning and Leadership at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and teaching faculty at Claremont Lincoln University. A longtime member of ILA, the International Leadership Association, he serves on the steering committee for the ILA Sustainability Leadership Member Community, as well as the ILA Committee for the Advancement of Leadership Programs. He is an active member of the Research University Community Engagement Network and serves as a recommended consultant for the Carnegie Elective Classification in Community Engagement and a reviewer for the Elective Classification in Leadership for Public Purpose. Most importantly, he's a father of two and enjoys hiking, travel, and photography. Okay, so we're having this conversation today, the week of Earth Day, because I had made a comment, I think at the end of a conversation with Jonathan Gosling for listeners, and I'd said something about, I don't know enough about this topic around sustainability and leadership, regenerative. I hear a lot of different terminology. And I kind of said that reflecting at the end of an episode. And I said, this is the one thing that just fascinates me about this podcast. For the last 3 years, I keep bumping into topics that I really don't know enough about and that I want to learn more about. So Rian, God love him, he sent me this email with really it was a annotated bibliography of resources. So I said, hey, you need to come on the podcast. And one of the first resources he highlighted was Kathy's work. And I said, let's do that with Kathy. So today, for listeners, this is a little bit of a dipping our toes in the water, as we kind of explore this topic. And again, I'm going to get into some definitional phrasings in just a moment. It's an opportunity for us to learn, and then we have a number of resources in the show notes for you if you'd like to dig deeper and explore this topic at greater depths. I think that would be wonderful. So Kathy Allen, the last time we spoke together was with Margaret Wheatley. So that conversation existed at 50,000 feet. And, hopefully today we can bring that down to 30,000 feet. As you think about this space, I just said to you before we even started recording, there's some terminology that I'm hearing that I think can be confusing at times. So would you take us through the landscape of some terminology that people might hear? And then what does that terminology kind of mean? And then Ryan, we'll go to you to kind of comment on that as well.
So I think everything in nature and also as human beings, as we evolve, our language and our thinking about a topic evolves. So I think initially we were framing this as sustainable leadership. Like Ryan, I've been on the steering committee, and like Ryan, I've co-chaired the ILA's Sustainable Leadership member community. And I think one shift is that leadership likes to put adjectives in front of the word leadership. And I think that the reason why that's been kind of an ongoing proliferation for a long time is that it's a way to differentiate traditional leadership and the outcomes of traditional leadership with something that's a different kind of outcome. So when you put ethical in front of leadership, then ethical becomes kind of a core measure and outcome of the kind of leadership you do. So with sustainability leadership, we were framing it from, well, maybe we should be starting to pay attention to what our long-term impacts are on each other and the natural environment. And we should be shifting the way we lead and the way we think and the way we make decision-making so it's more sustainable. But as things have evolved, we have realized maybe not everybody would agree with me, but the evolution, if you thought of a minus 100 to a plus 100 scale, minus 100 would be a degenerative outcome of leadership. So we would lead in a certain way that would diminish the vitality and resilience of a system. It would be more exploitive. It would harvest resources faster than nature could replenish them. So future generations would be significantly damaged. On a side comment, we could probably say that's what we've harvested from our traditional leadership frameworks, if you look back the last couple hundred years. Okay. So then you kind of move up to maybe green, and green is maybe, instead of a minus 100, maybe a minus 50.
Okay.
And then from there, you're kind of shifting direction, but you're not really doing it fast enough to really make a difference. Then you might go to 0, which would be the neutral spot, which is really where sustainability is. You're not doing damage going forward, but you're not repairing the damage that's already been done. And a plus 50 would be restorative. So it would be bringing an active, restorative rebalancing of the system. So again, you would serve future generations and you would start repairing the damage that you've left. And then the plus 100 would be regenerative. And so the regenerative frame is that literally we lead in a way that can keep pace in terms of using resources that can be harvested only at the rate of use. Many First Nations and indigenous communities, groups that are very deeply embedded in the land, tend to think with a regenerative mindset. Your purpose wouldn't be maybe the enclosure of wealth and power, but your purpose would be to ensure the social and ecological well-being of people and planet. So we can talk more about regenerative, but the other shift in language is the shift away from adjectives like regenerative leadership or sustainable leadership to leadership for, so leadership for sustainable or regenerative futures gets you to a slightly different tone and orientation, and it strengthens the fact that we're in the leadership business, but we're trying to be much more intentional about the outcome. And it's not just the outcome for now or for the individuals in the current system, but it's the outcome for future generations and the emergent future.
Stephen Kempster oftentimes will ask, leadership for what? And this in many ways nicely kind of frames up this is leadership for regeneration. And thank you for that description, because I think it's so helpful to visualize it in that way. I was just watching a documentary on Max about, I think it was bonsai trees. And it was this famously large company in the Pacific Northwest. Ryan, you would maybe know the name. And their advancement was that they were replanting the trees. That might put us at, what, like 25, I guess.
They could sometimes look like green as well, which is small movement towards the future, but maybe not enough keeping pace.
That's a great example to kind of play with a little bit, because I think it's a perfect encapsulation of some of the challenges that we face, right? Because if you extract a tree and replant a tree, that can kind of be treated as a zero-sum game, right? A long-term sustainability plan. But then there's actually a lot of disruption that's happening in that process to the ecosystem and to the animal and plant life around it and whatnot. So I don't think you're at kind of an even trade-off yet there. So yeah, to build upon Kathy's scale she was talking about.
And you're not in a closed system. So you as a company might make a choice, but you have a lot of other people in the system that might be counterbalancing any choice that you make if you don't make a big enough choice going forward.
Yeah.
So in my example there, I'm kind of constructing it as, oh, okay, they're replanting, and at least it's still even probably on that negative in that dimension.
Yeah, I think so.
Ryan, anything you'd like to add to Kathy's original framing of this topic? I think that was beautifully said.
Oh, yeah. Everything Kathy offers is beautifully said. Couldn't agree more. I think that for me, it is the answer to that question of leadership for what. I think it's a missing element that has been absent of the equation of leadership for too long. If we talk about leadership, followership, and context, for instance, like the global biosphere that we all reside in and depend upon is that context for leadership. It's the context that all leadership happens within and impacts in one way or another. And while it's incredibly difficult to kind of effectively account for this, which is, I think, why it's often been overlooked, because it's just an unknowable externality almost. But the more that we can do to build our capacity to recognize our impact on these natural systems and incorporate that into the decision-making and social and organizational structures that we're operating within, the better off we're going to be. And I don't know of many practices that are fully at that 100 regenerative world yet, but I know that that's some of the work that Kathy does with different organizations to help move them in that direction. And that's the work that I'm really interested in as well.
Talk a little bit about that, Kathy, if you would. I mean, what's so interesting in my head right now is I struggle to even think of an example of regenerative. And so maybe it's just your vision, but maybe you do have some examples of organizations that are working toward. Are there some case studies that stand out for you?
Yeah, because regenerative systems are interesting, because I know both of you are fans of systems thinking. And so when you think about regenerative, you're really thinking about and holding the whole system in the palm of your hand, or in the way you think you practice leadership. And most of our leadership is actually not thinking about the whole system. It's thinking about a part of the system. If you're looking at profit and productivity, those are parts of the system, but you can do profits and productivity and also be exploitive of your employees, or exploitive of natural resources, or you can do things that give you profit in the present, but actually create significant damage in the future. So one element of regenerative leadership that would be regenerative or have hallmarks of regenerative would be, number one, you would be serving the whole system. And that can be scaled up to the globe, basically, as opposed to only a part of the system. The idea that an organization could profit would be something that would be a parts orientation. So one of the shifts for regenerative would be towards the whole system. The second would be the expansion of the time horizon. So you start making decisions in the present in a way that you look at the costs and the benefits over time. The organizations that I've worked with that are moving in this direction, they might have started out with the assumption of a return on investment. So the ROI would be a kind of an aspect of their decision making. But if they couldn't make their money back for, let's say, buying solar panels to reduce the carbon footprint of their organization in 3 years, they would say, well, it's not a good return on investment. But now that language is shifting to a return on sustainable investment. So depending on the scope of the project and the overall impact of the project, you might say that it would be worth the investment, even if it took 10 or 15 years to get a return on future investments or future operational costs or things like that. So the extended time horizon also affects the way we think about leadership. It shifts it from an individual kind of activity where self-interest is assumed in most organizations, that every leader or senior leader, C-suite leader might have their own agenda, not the agenda of the whole, to thinking about themselves as a collective and the impact of their leadership as a collective. So I have one organization who has intentionally started to think of itself in terms of being part of a relay race as a leadership group. So they have inherited the baton from a past leadership in the organization's history. They have inherited the consequences of not thinking long-term, for example, or the way they've harvested resources, or the level of trust and goodwill they have with people in their organization. And then they're trying to not pass problems to the next generation of leadership in the organization. So what it does is it shifts the practical orientation from individual self-interest to paying attention to the strength and resilience and thrivability of the whole. And your goal would be that you would want your organization and the community it serves to continue to thrive 100 years from now. So by extending that time horizon, you're now making decisions within that time horizon, and you have a quality standard of thrivability and good long-term reputation over a 100-year span. And that's just not something that most organizations think about, especially some nonprofits who are just trying to figure out, how do I survive this budget year?
Yeah, what's the next grant? And kind of on that treadmill, so to speak.
We confuse productivity with activity when you're in that kind of short-term thing. And so we think that if we're active, we must be producing something. But in fact, that activity culture is really antithetical to sustainability and regenerative thinking. Nature is a beautiful teacher for regenerative design. And that's what I've discovered. I've discovered that leading from the roots is actually kind of a roadmap on how you get there. What do you have to let go of? What new practices should be considered?
Ryan, anything you want to add to that? For listeners, he's just kind of sitting there enjoying listening to Kathy speak. And now I've spurred this on him.
The thing is that Ryan has a big brain on this topic. So we need to draw him out and bring his wisdom into the table.
I'm really just a fan of Kathy that happens to be recorded in this process. So I'm enjoying.
Me too.
Yeah. I want to recognize that this work isn't brand new in the field and has some deep roots, if you will. Kathy is certainly one of those. She has publications from the 90s that read as if it was published yesterday on the topic, and was a big influence on me in developing my own professional contributions and work. I've done some writing on time horizons. That is absolutely, I think, an area that needs to be thought of and engaged with further. I think the fundamental element here is a worldview shift. So there's It's an important developmental process to help folks, if they aren't already coming to the table with this, to develop a connection to future generations, to develop a connection to the natural biosphere that we're all dependent upon, and to develop the systems thinking and systems literacy skills to effectively navigate those larger considerations in their more immediate environment. And it's a tall order. I understand why it's a difficult thing if you're unfamiliar with it, because you have all sorts of immediate pressures on your time and decision making and organizational constraints and whatnot. So it's really about organizational culture change being kind of the key element here, if not broader societal worldview change, that I think is what's necessary.
So check me on my thinking here. And I'm just going to say a couple things, and I'd love for you to say, yes, you get it, Scott, or no, you're off base. Okay, so let's start with like the UN sustainability goals.
Mm-hmm.
We're at a 0 there. Is that accurate on your scale?
I think if engaged with in a deeper way, it provides some scaffolding that can get you into the positive.
Okay.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we've got a baseline there. We've got this leadership for what? We would phrase it leadership for, how would you phrase it?
It could be regenerative design or leadership for a regenerative world, leadership that creates conditions conducive to the life of future generations, plant, animal, people, etc.
Okay, so we've got the 4. We've got the 4 there. And so there's a purpose to our activities. And what we're doing is we're trying to shift paradigms. And of course, we're bumping up against some systems that are capitalism, for instance, deep rooted into the DNA of, and so we're trying to shift not only the time horizon, but the overall purview of some of these organizations. Just like I think probably, the sustainability goals shifted. I mean, we're not going to go from realistically oil to solar immediately. There's some bridge activities here. And so the UN sustainability goals might be a bridge activity and shifting mindsets. And I think by conventional wisdom, Europe is much further ahead than the United States and probably the furthest of any continent, as I would understand it. And then there's some continents that they're not there yet.
And I would probably say the European Union is much more active in trying to figure this out. Not perfect, but as opposed to Europe as a generic,
great,
kind of territory.
Great. No, that's helpful. So we're bumping up against, and you have an individual. Let's just go to Greta Thunberg right now, real quickly. She would be somewhat of an activist who is trying to build awareness and trying to spark a movement to bring awareness. And so we have an individual like that, and she's meeting with some of these folks in the European Union and speaking at some of these events and having certain levels of, because again, she's bumping up against these large systems that will have to shift, correct? Have I somewhat kind of landed in the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think so. I also just want to point out it's incredibly useful to engage with public figures like Greta, right? And to from kind of a leadership analysis standpoint. But I think one of the core outcomes of a sustainability leadership lens is also distributed leadership, that this has to be everyone's responsibility and everyone's framework if we're going to get to where we need to go. And so while we can learn from, high profile activists and folks working in this space, it's about the day-to-day as much as anything else. And that's what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are about as well. It's meant to scale from the micro to the macro, from small little organizations or communities up to national and international policy and intergovernmental collaborations. And I think that scalability, right? So impacting us individually as well as collectively and systemically is what we need.
And I think you can take maybe 3 or 4 dimensions and then question the assumptions around them.
Kathy, I'm going to interrupt you. For the listeners, this is why I love Kathy. because she says we can think about this in 3 or 4 dimensions. Like, I can't even visualize 4 or 5 dimensions right now. But I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I just had to highlight that.
So, so you can take a dimension. So one dimension that moves you towards regenerative and sustainable is shifting your assumption from autonomy, separation kind of dimension to one of connectivity and interdependence. So let's unpack that for a minute. So if you're really truly embracing interdependence, that everything is connected, then it means that your choices, your organization's choices, your communities, your neighborhood choices, your choices even within family have a ripple effect, because interdependence means you're all connected to anybody anyway. But then how would that change our conversation about DEI, for example, if we started from a framework of interdependence and connectivity? Resilient systems are the most diverse systems. Fragility is a monoculture. Fragility is homogenetic, kind of groupings. We don't talk about that from a regenerative principle. We talk about it primarily from maybe a social justice framework. And while I think that's helpful, we're missing the whole framework that our current system, that is not very diverse sometimes in various pockets, is actually making us more fragile, less adaptive, less capable of thriving in the future. So that's a simple unpack. If you unpack it from a change perspective, interdependence means that you don't have to wait for people in positional power to tell us this is where we're going to go. Networks are flatter. Any change in any place in the system can, over time, create a collective mass that literally tips the system, whether the politicians are ready or not. I think that's actually what's going on today. But then if you take it into an organizational leadership frame, interdependence means that it's got to be more of a distributive leadership model. So you just kind of take one stream, connectivity, interdependence, and then you say, oh, well, that changes how we think about change, and it changes how we think about inclusion and biodiversity and difference, and it changes how we think about the leadership model that will be most adaptive for the future. So that's just one dimension. You go from closed system to open system. That's another dimension, and you can unpack that. So it's from short term to long term, another dimension of time. And from dead systems, inert organizations, to living systems. It's another one that you unpack. And so all of them have practice changes. And the other thing that I love about nature is it gives you something to hitchhike off of when you start thinking about leadership. So, for example, in nature, there's no CEO. So the traditional hierarchical frame is not actually present, but it's held together by two things. One is it has a very powerful purpose. So basically, every species has kind of embedded in its code to help create conditions conducive to the life of future generations. Creating conditions conducive. It's not an action plan. It's not a strategic plan. It's not a list of things, of goals and objectives to do. You're creating the conditions. And then nature basically embeds a self-organizing capacity in everything. So every individual is actively engaged in self-organizing, from a blade of grass to an ant colony to bees to bears to beavers to wolves, whatever. But in human organizations, we don't reinforce this self-directed, self-organizing capacity. So what does that mean for the way we think about leadership? Where we have melded leadership and management that is embedded in a hierarchical framework that doesn't think that anybody below a certain level in the organization has something to provide other than labor. So you start really seeing what's not working in the system and how much has to shift. Rian has a beautiful riff on this as well.
Go for it, Ryan.
Well, it's interesting. Most of Kathy's work, I think, if I can characterize it, is around organizational change and planning and evolution. And most of my work is with students, with individuals. So I'm really focused on that kind of worldview shift that we referenced earlier, and trying to help as many students as possible go out and do whatever they want to be doing with that worldview in place in all sorts of different sectors and settings. And that's what we need. And, in my experience with both undergrad and graduate students is that there's a hunger for an alternative to the norms, to the dominant paradigms that many of us are kind of trapped in right now. And so that gives me a great deal of hope for what's coming, because I think that there's a lot of yearning for a different way of being, a different way of engaging with one another, a different way of thinking that's emerging right now. But it's also coming in a context of urgency. We are feeling the daily effects now of climate change. Its impact is everywhere. And, we have these IPCC reports coming out talking about kind of the rapid evolution of global climate and climate change that's happening right now. And so I think that there's an urgency of going back to Greta's work. There's a terrible urgency that younger generations especially are feeling in terms of like, what kind of world am I inheriting now? And what is its trajectory? So on the one hand, that gives me a lot of hope because I think there's a ton of energy and movement in that direction. But I have to say that it also gives me great pause because we've let it go on so long in this one degenerative direction.
Yeah.
And I think to add to that, we have to get beyond the framework that protests in the streets are actually going to change the mindset. So I'm 100% with Ryan that it's really the worldview, the framework of how you see our relationship with each other, our relationship with nature, world around us. That shift, once you make it, changes just about everything in the system. I just recently did a 5-year review of some sustainability work that I'm doing with a big organization in Minnesota. And 5 years into it, we've had our ambitious 2030 goals set. But what we're noticing is that I would call it, we're about an inch away from embedding a sustainability mindset in the whole organizational culture. And once you do that, because what we're seeing is that it's showing up so that it's not just an efficiency criteria, but it's an efficiency, effectiveness, and long-term impact criteria to decision-making that is slowly just woven its way in. So once you go down a sustainability framework, it touches just about everything in an organization.
We have time for probably one more concept that you would like people to be aware of that you think is foundational for this conversation. Ryan, is there something that comes to mind for you? Is there something else that, just from a foundational standpoint, here's something to consider, to be aware of? And then I'll go to Kathy, and then we'll kind of close out.
Yeah, I had the great privilege a couple of years ago of working with an amazing writing team as part of the National Leadership Education Research Agenda process. And our contribution to that was around complex problem solving. And one of the core outcomes from that writing process was recognizing that sustainability, the skills and mindsets needed for a sustainability leadership approach were transferable. It's kind of an exemplar complex problem. And those skills and mind shifts for sustainability apply to a lot of other complex problems that we are equally wrestling with in the world right now. And so I think one of the deep insights of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is the interconnection between all of these complex challenges. You cannot effectively solve sustainability without also solving or working through social justice, to include something that was named earlier. They go hand in hand, right? The injustices of this world are coming from the same systems that are causing problems from a sustainability lens as well. And so I think that that inherent interconnection is important to recognize. And it, on the one hand, makes everything more complex. But on the other hand, if you can find solutions, it has a tendency to solve multiple challenges at once also.
Interesting.
I think that this whole framework of thinking in an integrated way is probably maybe a final comment. You know, we have so much training. I mean, like probably both of you, how many of us have spent a decade reading about management theory and practice, you know, and then leadership and human development and sustainability. But I got into the sustainability and regenerative design because I was trying to figure out, how do you move past the silo mentality? And we're not going to get to a thrivable future with a silo mentality. So it's this, how do we help people shift the way they think? And then in turn, how do we redefine our relationship with things like power? And we think about how we're moving power from zero sum, top down, rank ordered to integrative power, where you have this kind of predisposition for trust and collaboration, where there's a shift in the way we see ourselves in relationship to each other. So I think that there's great promise in this. And I guess the other final thing I would say is that the feedback loops are already in place. We're either going to go here kicking and screaming, or we're going to go here with an active, curious mind to try to figure out, how do we do it? What are we learning? What do we have to let go of? What do we have to discover? And I think if we can kind of see it more as an adventure rather than just as a scary kind of thing that we don't know if we're going to make it or not, it could be much more fun. And we would probably learn lots on the way.
Yeah.
Nature grows with feedback and information. That's basically how it sets up. And we're getting feedback from all kinds of systems that the way we've been interacting with each other in the world is not working. How much damage do we want to tolerate before we eventually lean in and decide, oh, well, maybe there's another way. Maybe we should explore that.
Therein lies the leadership challenge and opportunity. You know, I love how you phrase that. I just highlighted one of your blog posts in my newsletter, Kathy, and you say, can you step into that space with some curiosity and try and learn? And because it's a fascinating puzzle. I mean, for the last part of this conversation, my mind keeps going to Keegan, or adult development, and of course your work in human development. I mean, in some ways, if you have a lot of, socialized minds wandering around and in positions of authority, how do we help that transition so that people are seeing more of the whole? So people are valuing more of the whole. They have a mind that is, yes. And can we make some of that transition in time? Can we as humans evolve to that level of thinking?
Well, the other thing that Ryan and I have talked about is that it's amazing and puzzling and surprising to me how many organizational leaders don't feel the urgency that I feel and that Ryan feels around this topic, because it seems so obvious to us, I think. Wouldn't you agree, Ryan? And it's like, what is it? Are we not curious enough? What's really going on there? I don't know.
Well, it gets back to some of those words I think you all have used. I mean, power. I mentioned the word capitalism, and are we playing by the same rules? And do we have a collective set of shared values around a couple of things? I mean, my mind has also gone to some of the challenges around artificial intelligence around the world. I mean, one of the big challenges there is it's an arms race. And so it's hard to put that, they call it the containment problem in that realm, that you can't contain it.
And the algorithms within AI are being built on our past, not on our emergent future.
Yes.
Basically, it's reinforcing what we probably should be letting go of.
And so the U.S. might decide to put together some rules and some policies, but if China barrels ahead and all of a sudden gains supremacy. Well, now we're behind and we're, weak, quote unquote. And so, yeah, the competing commitments in this are just, it's gnarly. But, something I'm going to walk away with in this conversation, which I'm very, very appreciative of, is that I'm starting to better understand the leadership for what. And in this nook and cranny of the conversation, it's a faction of individuals who are passionate about leadership for this. This is the ultimate purpose. Okay, what have the two of you been listening to, reading, streaming, or what's caught your attention recently? It may have to do with something we just discussed. It may have nothing to do with what we just discussed. But what's something that's caught your attention recently?
I just started reading this book called Slow Productivity.
Okay.
It's the lost art of accomplishment without burnout.
Okay.
So Cal Newport wrote it. He's also the guy who wrote Digital Minimalism and Deep Work. But it's about, let's get clear about the difference between activity and then paying attention and doing what is productive activity. What should we be focusing on that really matters, as opposed to filling our days up with stuff, getting more stressed about because we're not getting through our stuff.
Rian?
Well, there's so much. I'm going to go completely unrelated. I am really enjoying a new show, Shogun. And there's so interesting to see the cultural elements, but also kind of the political navigation elements that those characters are going through. I had a chance to bring my family to Japan for the first time this past summer, and we had a wonderful experience there. So Shogun is my current go-to show that I'm just loving so far.
Good.
And the current question I'm trying to figure out is, what are the conditions that are conducive to the cultivating of wisdom? We got an elder up here.
Well, again, I mean, my mind goes to Keegan when you say that. I mean, how do we, that you have the whole adult development industry now, but you have the vertical development to horizontal development, and how do we create conditions to Ryan was speaking to it a little bit, so that literally the mindset shifts and we're seeing a larger perspective versus walking out and staying in my silo of what's best for the world, or even worse, what's best for me. If we go to like level 2.
And ensuring that development is accessible to as many people as possible.
Yeah, how do you scale that?
Executive coaching and whatnot. Yeah.
Okay, you all. As always, such a pleasure. Ryan, thank you for being a spark for this conversation. Very, very much appreciate it. Take care, you all. Be well.
Okay, thank you.
To Ryan, thank you so much for reaching out, connecting, following up with those resources. Again, all of you can find those resources that he sent me in the show notes so that you can learn more about this topic. And to Kathy and Ryan, thank you so much. This episode, combined with the previous conversation with Steve Kempster, I think has me a little further down the road. Of course, there's so much to learn, but leadership for what? Well, the planet. And Jonathan Gosling, where a lot of this conversation started, of course, has some initiatives that he's working on, One Planet Leadership, which I will also place in the show notes. So everybody take care. Thank you so much for joining and checking in. If you like what's going on here, share it with others. Please, please, please. Got a lot of fun conversations coming up this summer. Take care, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.